Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We get straight to the point as the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Robotyne, and this has been geolocated with the latest footage showing the Russians gaining positions within the western parts of the village, and with this the Russians are now one step closer to recapturing the village. The Ukrainians have held control over this village since the Ukrainian summer offensive of last year, and it's now been over half a year since they got control of it. Since then, the Russians have been counterattacking towards the village, trying to regain some of the lost positions after the Ukrainians' failure to gain the goals of their summer offensive, which were to capture not just Tokmak, but also Melitopol and Berdyansk, and cut the Russian land bridge between Russia and Crimea. They only managed to gain the village of Robotyne in this section of this front line, so the Russians are here looking to negate all of the gains the Ukrainians made during their summer offensive in this upcoming spring offensive of the Russians. The Russians throughout the winter have been focusing mainly in the Donetsk direction, where they've managed to gain their goals of this winter offensive before the winter ended, and that is capturing Avdiivka and Marinka here to the southwest of the city. With these developments, we see that the Russians now have control of not just Avdiivka and they have the village of Pervomaiske, they have also gained control over Marinka. The goals that they haven't achieved so far towards the end of the winter is the village of Novomikhailivka to the southwest of Donetsk and Pervomaiske directly to the northwest of Donetsk. So far they've gained the biggest two goals, but they have left out the smaller goals, which are Novomikhailivka and Pervomaiske. The Russian winter offensive has so far been more successful than the Ukrainian summer offensive, and since then the Russians have used up a lot of its forces, but not even close enough to prevent them from continuing these offensive operations, so the Russian offensive will continue into the spring season. The Russian offensive is likely going to strengthen in the spring season as well. The Russians are looking to commit even more forces to their offensive operations, where their targets are going to be everything from the north and down to the south. As is written in this article by the New York Times, 5 places Russia is fighting to break through Ukrainian lines. Outmanned and outgunned, Ukrainian ground forces are in perhaps their most precarious position since the opening months of the war. This article talks about the 5 different parts of the front line where the Russians are launching their offensive operations. They're missing out a 6th one, but let's just go with this. We see that the Russians are fighting first off in the direction of Avdiivka, where they managed to capture the city. Marinka, they here again managed to capture the city. In the direction of Robotyne, here it has recently started in the past few days, and they've already gotten a foothold within the village. In the direction of Bakhmut and Kreminna, there's been a lot of positional fighting and small advances, but nothing serious has been captured except for open fields. These are still in their opening stages. So what we're seeing through the winter season, starting out with Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to capture a long-time Ukrainian stronghold. It is a city that has held for its positions for 10 years. The Ukrainians have been preparing it and fortifying it since the first outbreak of the Ukrainian civil war and in the subsequent ceasefire deal between the Donetsk People's Republic and Ukraine. The Ukrainians had fortified it further and further to the point at which, when you zoom into the map, you can see not just the artillery hulls from the civil war and the subsequent peace treaty that ended up having a lot of artillery barrages between two sides, but also levels and tiers and just huge amounts and swaths of fortifications and trenches all throughout the whole city area. And through this, the Russians managed to advance and capture the whole city here in the winter season. In reality, the Russian offensive did not just start in the winter season. It started in the 1st of October 2023, but it has slowly been increasing in strength and intensity over this period of time. The Russians are now operating in active operations in 7 different parts of the front line. The New York Times point out 5 of these, which is the first one, Avdiivka, where the Russians managed to take control over the city. Then in the direction of Marinka, where the Russians also managed to gain control of the city and has since then moved in a western direction towards Rehorivka and in a southern direction towards Pobieda. And this has also allowed the Russians to start their operations in the direction of Novomikhailivka after the Russian capture of Marinka in the late December of last year. So with this, we see that over the past 2 months, the Russians have been fighting over Avdiivka. They've gotten closer and closer to the town, and now they've gained a foothold and have control over the eastern parts of it, and trying to get a foothold in the southern parts where they've gained control over the cemetery. So with these advances, the Russians are getting closer to the capture of the town, but there's been no advances over the past 3 days, which indicates that the Ukrainians are putting up a tough fight, preventing further Russian advances since then. The next point is Robotyne. Here the Russians just recently started their offensive operations, and in this section of the front line they've managed to gain a foothold. They've also managed to gain control over the trenches to the west and to the south of the village, and they are launching a pincer maneuver on the east to cut off the Ukrainians east of the anti-tank ditches, and likely also to attack here to the northwestern direction, as the Russians are looking to cut off all of the Ukrainian forces here to the southeast of Robotyne. At the same time, the supply situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians, as the muddy season has begun despite it still being winter, and the Ukrainians are forced to use the only supply route as the highway, being the only supply route that they are able to use. While the Russians are of course facing the same problem, the muddy season isn't an issue for the ones who are advancing. It is instead an issue for the ones who are lacking of supplies. As such, the first drive into a town or village is of course going to be through muddy weather. However, the mud doesn't really affect that much when it's the first drive. But when you go back and forth 100 times, that is when vehicles start getting stuck in the mud. The first time you drive over muddy dirt, you do not get stuck. The 100th time you do. This is why the Russians are looking to capture this quickly. They send IFVs quickly to the front line, the trenches west and south of Robotyne. Then they disembark with their infantry, moving through the forest areas, trenches, and reach into storming the village, getting a foothold within it, and start attacking there. The main issue would be if this battle dragged out, but there's also the highway that goes here from the south towards Robotyne. This is why the Russians are also looking to gain control over the southern area of Robotyne to prevent the Ukrainians from having the same positions as the Russians do here to the north of Robotyne, having an operational fire control over the northern supply road of Robotyne. While the forest areas and fields will be very difficult to resupply from, the highway is easy because it's paved. As such, the Russians could resupply the village of Robotyne through the highway to the south if they secure the flank of the supply route. The same with the Ukrainians to the north of Robotyne. But the Russians now have gotten a foothold in Robotyne, and not just there, but in the area of the highway. If the Russians move in the northern direction, they can gain full control of it and physically cut it off. If not, they can attack in the western parts and get a position where they can shoot at any of the trucks going through the highway, which would limit the supplies going through to the north of Robotyne. The Russians, with a quick and decisive victory over Robotyne, would be able to essentially cut off all the eastern parts of Robotyne from supplies, leaving hardly any supply routes for those soldiers. Therefore, the Russians would be able to either force the Ukrainians to withdraw from these positions or simply weaken them significantly by cutting off their supplies. So the Russians are looking to capture Robotyne quickly. This is why we've also already seen the Russians get a foothold, and they've captured the fortifications to the south and to the west of the village, which leaves the Ukrainian in a precarious position, just as the New York Times article says. Moving on to the next section, we see in the direction of Kreminna, the Russians are looking to gain towns that they lost in 2022 during the Kharkiv offensive of the Ukrainians, and with this we see that the Russians have been pushing in a western direction from Geolocated and Kreminna since then. The Russians have gotten closer and closer, now inching closer and closer to the villages of Kreminna and Lyman. They're also very close to Sarishne and Torske here to the southwest. And with this, we see that there is a lot of positional fighting taking place here in the Kreminna direction, and we're soon to enter the operational stage or the active stage, where the Russians will look to storm the villages of Kreminna and Lyman, Sarishne and Torske. This will allow the Russians to cut off the significant supply routes going to the Serbyanki forest area, and if they manage to do that, they could take control over it as well, allowing them to then start pushing towards Lyman with the control over the east of the Serbets River. They can also start attacking Nevske and Avdiivka to the north, which will allow them to gain full control over the eastern bank of the Serbets River, and as such focus their forces here to the south, having a stronger flank with the river line being their defensive positions, and then start operations towards Lyman, which would be their next target in this section. Now, the two areas that the New York Times article doesn't mention is after the Battle of Bakhmut, where we see that the Russians have regained momentum since they finished parts of the Ukrainian summer offensive. We saw two main developments. The first one is that the Russians managed to recapture all of the lost positions in the northern flank, and the second thing was the Russians failed to recapture the lost positions in the southern parts. The fighting in the south have been very positional, there's been a lot of back and forth, but the Russians have so far failed to capture Klishchiivka and Avdiivka from the Ukrainians. In the northern flank, however, they have kept pushing and are now very close to Ivanivska and Bohdyanivka. They have a foothold within Bohdyanivka, which they've had for a long time, as positional fighting continues within the village. As for the Ivanivska direction, we see here that the Russians have been pushing it from the northern and eastern directions to the point that they now have a foothold in the trenches to the east of the village and have gained control over all of the fortifications to the north and parts of the village. So with these developments, we see that the Russians are very close to the active stage, which is them storming the village itself. With these developments, it is clear that the Russians are looking to gain full control over the western parts of Bakhmut, cutting the eastern parts of the canal in two, leaving the southern parts isolated from the northern and western parts. And with this, the Russians will look to regain control over Klishchiivka and Avdiivka and the whole southern parts of the canal line. With this, the Russians would be able to focus their forces in the northern direction, capturing Bohdyanivka, Kreminna, and Lyman before starting operations either further north in the direction of cutting off Siversk, but this is a large endeavor. Instead, it is likely that the Russians will look to cross the canal and gain a foothold and control over Chasiv Yar to the west. So an operation towards Chasiv Yar is the likely next goal of the Russians in the Bakhmut direction, after gaining control over the east of the canal line, going through from Ivanivske in the center, Klishchiivka and Avdiivka in the south, Lyman and Bohdyanivka in the north. This will likely be the targets of the Russians before they move further westwards. Combining that with the capture of Avdiivka, the Russians will look to attack in the northern direction from this position, while attacking in the western direction from Bakhmut, which would allow them to flank the positions of Konstantinivka, pincering it from two directions. There's also the possibility that the Russians will focus on the western direction, trying to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a new defensive line and getting their own positions by the river lines and the railways to the north, allowing them to have a large buffer zone to the northwest of Avdiivka, and then launching attacks to the north. It is clear that the Russians are looking to gain full control over the Donetsk region. This is why the main fighting is taking place here. The two areas that is not mentioned in the New York Times articles are the Kupiansk front here to the north and the Volodar front to the south. It is likely that the Russians will continue fighting in Novomikhailivka until they gain control over the town, then move further westwards to Konstantinivka, which intersects the road going from Marinka to Volodar. And with control over that, the Russians will look to restart the operations in the direction of Volodar, directly towards it from the eastern parts here from Solotke, and in the direction of Konstantinivka in a southern direction, which would allow them to completely cut off all supply routes in and out of Volodar. This is likely an operation for the spring season. It looks like the Russians are planning for the main push of this offensive so far, being the spring season, where they'll look to gain control over the final parts, which is the Chasiv Yar direction, in the direction of Lyman, developing the situation there for the summer, in the Kupiansk direction, capturing Sinkivka and moving further south, and again preparing for the summer. These areas are ones where the Russians will unlikely fight until the summer season begins. In the central parts, it will look like the Russians will continue pushing through the spring season and again wait for the summer. It seems that all of the spring operations that are going to be taking place over the next period of time are developing situations for further offensive operations that will take place in the summer, when the Russian army has grown even stronger, even bigger, with more equipment and a larger army. As such, the Russians will look to grind down the Ukrainians in this period of time and develop their situations to have better positions for the upcoming summer offensive. So it is likely that the Russians will continue as is, with small infantry assaults, a lot of artillery, a lot of bombings with the FAB bombs, and then continue positional fighting until the summer season or even the winter season next winter, before launching larger scale assaults where they'll look to gain control over the whole Donbass region and possibly even develop situations here in the Zaporizhia front. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.